Hi everyone, and welcome to a conversation with Rhoda Roberts. It's great to have you with us here today. I'm Rob Coombs, and we're coming to you from Interface's office and showroom in central Sydney. So let me start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation, and we'd like to extend our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and equally extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across Australia. So before I ask Rhoda to introduce herself, let me start by trying to set some context for the conversation. Why are we having this? And the aim today is to try to draw together a few themes around the concept of reconciliation between First Nations people and non-Indigenous Australians. And within that, it's a conversation about what is the role of business, what should Interface do in that context. It's about attempting to offer some understanding as we continue to address the home project that we've been working on now for a number of years, and then the connection to the introduction of our Upon Common Ground product collection in October. So to attempt to offer a foundation of understanding to support that. And then ultimately, from an Interface perspective, it's about attempting to draw some connections to the core purpose that we've defined for ourselves over the past 25 years and the concept of the reconciliation in Australia. So that's what we're going to try and do today. A number of you might be sitting there thinking, why the hell are we applying energy, resources, and time to this conversation? And as someone who's been with the company for a long time, it occurs to me that we're asking the same questions some 25, 26 years ago as we started to ask ourselves about the involvement we had in terms of environmental sustainability as a company. And we were asking, why the heck should we be concerned about that as an issue? And of course, it quickly emerged that there was a very clear role to play for Interface in that space, and we've been committed to that ever since. And I think we're going to find here that as we get into a better understanding of reconciliation, that the same process will occur, and we will soon understand the role that we have and the need for us to make a really positive contribution both as a company and as individuals. So that's my hope as we move through this process. So on that note, I'd like you to welcome Rhoda Roberts to the conversation. And I think I'm probably fairly ill-equipped to introduce her in a way that does her justice. So I'm going to ask Rhoda to share with us her history, background, and who she is. So Rhoda, over to you, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Rob. And hi, everyone. Well, my name's Rhoda Roberts. I'm a Widjabul Wyabul woman from the Bundjalung territories of northern New South Wales, southeast Queensland. I guess I am very fortunate that I get the opportunity to work in the arts and cultural space. I've worked across the creative industries in a number of positions, from television to film as an actor, a journalist, and into looking at events and festivals. And I guess for me, in 2022, it is absolutely an honour to be able to be handed this legacy of those who went before me. And I feel that perhaps they were guiding me, that this is the work that I need to do to ensure that our cultural maintenance continues for the long term.
Wonderful. So Rhoda has been helping us over the past 18 months or so as we have evolved our work around the home project. And we are delighted that you could be here to share this, Rhoda. So let me start by asking you, where do we start? Where would you start as we attempt to get into an understanding around the need for reconciliation between First Nations and non-Indigenous people here in Australia? Where do you start that conversation?
There are many conversations, and I think we do need to look at the different types of psychology and philosophy we have about who we are as peoples. any relationship is a two-way relationship, and those relationships that work best are on trust and love and faith. And I think when we start to look at reconciliation action plans, particularly the first ones that you undertake, it really is getting to know who you are as an organisation, but who is the community around you and how you engage. And, you know, there are a lot of assumptions, and in our inner voice, we often hear many different assumptions, and we're often proved incorrect. For Aboriginal people, the philosophy of land and how we're connected to country is very different to the philosophy of those who arrived and saw this country for ownership, property development, and a financial transaction almost, where for us it really is about the stewardship of country, the inherited birthrights where we need to take obligations seriously. And so we have a very different view of what land, sea and waterways are. And I think once we all start to look at how both sides think, we then can come to a lovely middle area where we go, what is it about this nation that we want? We want to be a better nation. We do want a future for our children, a sustainable future. And if you look at land management from our people, it has always been about sustainability. It has always been about not profiting, but ensuring that there's enough for everyone. And for me, a reconciliation action plan is almost a blueprint to understand each other. And often in the past, Aboriginal people used to feel like, oh, so they want us to fix the problem. When you talk about reconciliation, often it's like, oh, well, the Aboriginals will tell us what to do. Mm-hmm. And not so much. For First Nations, we really want to close that gap, but we want to close the gap from a cultural perspective. If you go into any Aboriginal community across the country, you will find a place in society. You are named and given a skin group and a family because you have to coexist, and we need to know where you fit in the family group. And that's a real generosity. And then the knowledge you learn from those senior leaders and custodians enables you to work within that family. So I think if there's more understanding of that way of how we approach, and that Australians want to come and learn about our processes and knowledge systems, which have been effective for thousands of years, then that truly is closing the gap.
You made a very powerful point to Trish and I a couple of weeks ago. I felt when you talked about the different levels of understanding that Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples have about each other. Could you talk a bit about that?
I think one of the big things is I talk about assumptions, and for Aboriginal people, if you can understand the history that has occurred post arrival, is, you know, the fear of anything associated with authority. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, the authorities came in and they took the land, they took the children and so forth. And we know that history now because we've spoken about it for decades. But for us, there is work to do when we think of reconciliation alongside our allies and colleagues, is that mistrust is so cemented in our lives because we're very cautious, because we've lost so much. So we have to gain that trust. We have to know that institutions are prepared to make changes. And I think by having a RAP, what really happens is you've made an actual visible commitment. People see that you have a RAP, and so you have to continue
to deliver on that.
Yeah, that discussion. But yes, I think understanding why there is this fear from both sides.
Yeah.
And why are Australians so fearful? And so when I say this country is transforming, truly, if my grandmother knew I could speak my language openly in front of authority, she would never have thought that day would be possible. So we are making huge shifts, although it seems very slow. We're at the toddler stage.
Yeah. I think the line that you used a couple of weeks ago was as First Nations people, we know everything about you,
Oh, yes.
but you know nothing about us. And that was a wow moment for me, which I guess talked to the need for us to really get engaged and to start to understand. You know?
Absolutely, yes. We've gone through the Western system. Many of our people live in a two-world system where they're at home, they've got obligation, they're actually living and working by their knowledge systems that they've learnt, and then also they know how to navigate the Western world. So yes, we do know everything about that Western world. And what we want to do, and I think this is why we have elders and custodians, and their generosity is they truly want Australians to understand us and our world. And, you know, it takes serious devastation for us to start looking very closely at each other. And I think when we look at land management now, particularly after the fires and the engagement of our fire stick people and how they do varying burn-offs, whether they're cool burns, mosaic burns, that information is really based on seasonal behaviour and knowledge systems. And more of those that work in that industry, firefighters, are engaged and are learning the ways that we managed fire. And that's a huge step. So they're starting to understand our principles and our schooling. And I think when we can combine that, because you don't lose anything when you share knowledge, you actually gain new friends.
Absolutely. So do you see a role for business in this whole story?
Look, I think a lot of businesses naturally in this century are really looking at treading lightly, looking at sustainable and what their green footprint is and sustainable practices. Really important. But for business to engage with First Nations, you really need to look at what is the equity of your business. Are you engaging First Nations? And if you are, where do they fit in the structure? Are you deep listening to the elements they bring? We need each other. You know, we've got a whole generation who've been through the university system. We have scientists, dentists, mathematicians, you name it. Every industry we have expertise in now. But also there's those community people who have expertise in ancient knowledge. Nothing was ever written down. It was mapped. The oral story process ensured that would continue. There were the archives that are the engravings in trees, the carvings in stone. That's just as much of learning business as conducting and governance, you know?
Yeah.
And I think there is a process and a way that we can come together, and it's not going to happen overnight. You know, I'll be very honest, one of the biggest issues we face as First Nations peoples getting into the employment sector is still very difficult for many. And I would say if you're running a business, don't look at the way someone writes. Look at what they're talking about and what their action is.
So what are some of the main factors that hold First Nations people back in an employment role there? What are the main issues there, do you think?
Look, I only can speak from a personal level, but when I look at my community, one of the biggest things that holds people back is, one, we've been told we're not worthy and we actually believe it.
Okay.
So we need to empower our young people and give them value. In New South Wales, we are the gateway to Australia for Aboriginal Australia, First Nations, Torres Straits. And yet often we'll see imagery, iconic symbols that relate to central desert regions or the Kimberley or Arnhem Land and Cape York, and yet we have a thriving culture in this state and we never see the visibility of it. And I think, and across the country in a lot of around urban areas, but indeed regional areas as well, people are still living under their cultural systems, but they've never had that voice. But it really is about opening up and capacity building, but opening up those positions where people who aren't confident in their educational academia qualifications can bring something else, and allowing that accessibility, you know, just to do an interview. filling out a form can be very daunting for a lot of First Nations people. But if you get them to do the interview or a video and to tell you about who they are and why they would want to work for your company, I can guarantee you'll be surprised. Because one thing about First Nations people, and it's based on our principles, is once you make a connection and a relationship with someone, whether it's your work colleagues, a business, there is loyalty. They will die for you, but there is also that is lifelong. You've developed a relationship. In our world, it is for the rest of your life.
Okay, terrific. Thank you for that. Let me try and explain, or trying to articulate how I think we've come to this as a company, and why we want to engage in the concept of reconciliation and continue the work that we're doing with our RAP. And for me, it goes back to some of the conversations, some of the comments that were made by our company's founder, Ray Anderson, some 25, 26 years ago, when he started talking about the power of business as an institution. And he made the point that business as an institution was the most powerful on earth. It was more powerful than government. It was more powerful than the church. And with that power comes a responsibility. And you can choose to exercise that as a force for good, as a force for change, if you so choose. And he was making those comments in the context of environmental sustainability and talking about our need to engage in that subject and to start to tread more lightly. And he was also saying in that context that actually it was our business that had for the last 200 years created the issues with the natural environment that we had to solve. So we had to get involved and engage. And I think there are so many parallels here, with this conversation. So as an institution, business is a powerful force across society and across communities. We have a huge influence in terms of the way that people run their lives and lead their lives. Therefore, we have a responsibility to exercise that in the right way and to be a force for positive change. So, I think there's absolutely a need there that aligns with the way that we've been thinking about our place in the world for many years. And then there's this wonderful side connection, side benefit for interface linked to what we are learning about First Nations connection to country. So, we in our own little way have been trying to tread lightly for the last 25 years. First Nations people have been doing that for the past 65,000 years. And I think there's an enormous opportunity here for interface to learn from that and apply it to the way that we're looking at our world, and to engage in that from a whole series of different perspectives. So from my point of view, that's why. Does that make sense to you? Does that kind of resonate?
More than resonates.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons, Rob, why I really wanted to get involved with the Home Project. What Interface was doing with this project was really, unknowingly, I think, was redistributing the power. We're an ever-adapting culture, and we have to live with our environment. We can use corrugated iron like no one else. We've learned to adapt with that as a new material. But we also look at how we read country every day. We're working with the seasons. We do certain practices because of the different 6 seasons of country. And then when you look at the Home Project and going into schools and learning from elders, a whole different classroom of education, taking young children on that journey and looking and reading country. So they're looking at the flowers that are out, what is on the ground, what the winds are doing. They're hearing all this knowledge from the elders, and then they start to draw it. And I think when I think of how do we bring those sort of elements of reading country, which is so important, to reading a school textbook in a classroom that has covering. We stand on earth and we read it. And if I was to stand on this mat that's in front of us now, I can see patterning there. That means mountain ranges, river systems. And so we might not be able to walk on the earth in our classrooms, but we're certainly walking on country because it's in the
It
carpeting.
resonates.
The story is still on the ground that we're walking on.
Fantastic.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that actually links to my next question. So I was going to ask you, when you talk about and think about connection to country, of course, most of us are living in urban environments. We are selling into the built environment. How do you draw a connection between sort of, if you like, contemporary country that most of us are engaged with and involved in and live within? How do you make use of the learnings from the connection to country that First Nations people had in this sort of more contemporary Western environment?
I'm always amazed, and again, it goes back to that eons of oral storytelling, how they maintained those stories. So you can walk through Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and I do feel very deeply for those communities whose country it is, because often they hear, oh, let's go out onto country. We're all on country, no matter where we are.
Mm-hmm.
And below the bricks and mortar are the stories, and they are still there. And, you know, in Sydney alone, it has the largest rock art in the world, ancient rock art that tells stories, that connects with the language of country. And so this revitalisation we've seen of, looking at Dharawal language or the Sydney language basin groups is so encouraging, because when you hear the language, you learn a bit more, because the language actually describes the landscape you're on.
Mm-hmm.
The names of places describe what that terrain was like. And, you know, in Sydney alone, if you walk down and you see the markings now in brass on the cement walkways, you know where the Tank Stream was, a very important waterway for the Gadigal. It was a place that would lead down to the harbour. And of course, when you mix channel with salt water, great fishing points.
Mm-hmm.
So there are these stories all around the city that are still there. And I think that's when you do engage with the local Aboriginal community, never think that it's all been lost. Yes, of course, there's much that has gone, but there's still a lot that was put into safekeeping. And they would talk about it. They would say, oh, that story's sleeping. One day when the time is right, it will be reawakened and we can retell it again. And I truly think we are now in the awakening. I think as a nation, we're ready to hear those stories. And I think that's why I really love the Home Project, because it wasn't just in rural or regional areas, it was also in the built environment. And yet there were those old aunties and uncles, whether they were custodians or elders, they were able to engage with young people and tell them the story of country. And once you know the story of country, it really connects you. You know, Australians, we travel the world. We're so proud of our country, the great sporting nation. We are a great sporting nation, and many of our First Nations have won gold for Australia. But we're also the oldest living adapting culture on the planet. And we need to own that truth. And once we own it, we are so unique. Our landscape is unique. We've managed to live in this climate beyond 200 years, but our new arrivals have lived and managed to work country. And I think that's where we are. We're learning to develop the land. We're really learning to think about it and where it takes us in 50, 100 years.
Yeah.
And all of us are family. And so as parents, all we want is equality and a better sustainable future for our grandchildren's children. And if we think like that, I think we can tackle anything.
Fantastic. Yeah. You talked earlier about education and how important is that, do you think, and what's emerging there at a schools level now that ultimately will help a better understanding?
Look, as business grows, it is getting more, I guess, collaborative. And to work in business, and particularly of some of the wonderful transformative businesses we can see for the future of Australia, we need to have governance and we need to have people who understand those systems. And so whether it's in the sciences and looking at the Barrier Reef to the NASA space station in Arnhem Land, we need our people in those areas as well, whether they're engineers, astrophysicists and so forth. So education is so important. And the old people recognise that. They always push for everyone to get an education. And it hasn't been as accessible, but today we are seeing huge numbers. University graduates go back onto country and apply that Western knowledge to their traditional knowledge. And that's where we're seeing huge change. If we look at the way water systems are working, we only have to think of Brad Mogridge. He's a First Nations Milleroi man who is a water scientist. I think he's the only First Nations water scientist globally, so a lot of people come to him. And so he's looking at the way we regard water and how the CSIRO are working with those engineering and new opportunities. And so combining the education with the knowledge is the way forward. Okay. And we will create businesses that are so unique around the world that people will start to look at us. And we've seen that just happen recently with the European fires during the heat wave across, Greece and everywhere, is they're calling on Australians to go and help them because we do have that knowledge of fire now. So my big push is engage with Aboriginal people, empower those young men, particularly those young men. Every day of their lives they are profiled. Right. And when you walk into a shop and someone thinks you're a thief, or you're driving a car and you're pulled over because they're not sure if it's registered to you, it chips away at you. So if you can embrace a young Aboriginal man to work in your company, or a woman, you will be rewarded. You'll be rewarded by a family who it could be the first time in their lives that there's been someone in the family that has a job, a position, is employed and valued. And that changes lives. Wow. Just one job will change a family. And that's reconciliation. Yeah. And reconciliation is about us all coming to terms with what the truth is. We know what happened. We don't have to go over the last 200 years. We know it all happened. How do we own it and move on? And I think that's the biggest challenge that we're facing now as individuals, but also as community. How do we move on together?
Yeah. So linked to that, of course, the big conversation going on right now is around the prospect of a referendum about a voice in Parliament. What are your thoughts on that?
Extraordinary. The Uluru Statement of the Heart was developed in 2017, and there had been a lot of undertaking going around the country talking to people and to get them out to the heart of the nation to discuss what this could be. What is the voice? Is it a symbolic gesture? Is it recognition that we were here before and we were a civilized society? And what would that voice bring us? And there are four camps really across the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander world at the moment about what it is. And like every community, we have those for and those against. And, we have senators in the country party as well as ministers in the Labor and the current government. So we need to remember how we listen, how we deeply listen to those knowledge people who have guided us for centuries. So I think as a nation, we really need to start listening. We do need to have that discourse from all the camps and find what the fear is. What does it give us for our future? What does a voice in Parliament mean? What does recognition in the Constitution mean? And it's pretty simple. We've just got to work out in the bureaucracy that is Parliament House, with changing governments over the years, what is the plumbing we need and what is the outcome that we're really looking forward to. I appreciate that the Uluru Statement has a lot of heartfelt and a lot of truth. And I think we need to come to the truth, own it, and maybe that's a way that we say, hey, we all own it together and the voice is something that we work towards.
Okay.
But there are very many different positionings on it, whether it's the voice, whether it's a treaty, what our sovereign status is as a First Nations group with the United Nations. There's lots to unpack.
So we're not there yet.
Yeah, and I don't think we've unpacked it.
Yeah.
But we have a race because they've stamped a date of November 23. And so now we need to be thinking about it and what it means for our children. Because at the end of the day, we're not going to be here to see the results. I'm old, you know, but I know my great-great-grandchildren will benefit.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. You've sort of covered a bit of this as you've been explaining your thoughts to us. We talked a lot about the why we should be engaging in this way. What and how should we exercise that? So what should we do? If there's somebody watching this video sitting in Melbourne, what should I do to make some first steps towards a better understanding of reconciliation and some kind of positive contribution? What should we do? Where do we start?
Where do we start? I think immediately having the dialogue with the local communities where your business is placed, really understanding what was happening on the place where your building is. Right. So once you know about your belonging in that building and what ground you're sitting on, you're able to go out. I think making connections with community is vital. You know, bring in an auntie to tell her local story for a morning tea with your staff, and you will be surprised at her generosity, but you'll also be surprised at the little anecdotal stories they have. Whether it's about a boundary street when they were girls, they weren't allowed to enter after 6 p.m. You'll be shocked by the stories, but it will make you understand why. You know, our grandmothers all went through the Depression and whether it was the Second World War or the Vietnam War, they all have stories of that time. And when you hear those stories, you understand why Nana, irons her underwear or keeps all the brown paper bags. You understand it because you see her sense and place of when she was young. But you've never heard those stories from our people. So it's just starting to engage initially. I think reconciliation action plans, for me, working in the cultural sector, it's so vitally important because don't try and do everything. I really think just doing 1 or 2 things in the first year, then maybe 3 as you grow with the different systems you go through with the RAPs. But it really is setting those KPIs and being true to them. So not writing all this waffle about how fabulous we're going to be, but what is it something that your business can achieve? And it might be employing 1 First Nations person working in marketing. We all know the stories now. We've got the product and the content, but we don't know how to sell it because we're not engaging with that 2-way voice. And so, someone in marketing will bring enormous value to a company. But it is it is the commitment. Yeah. And it's also, you don't realise what it feels like as an Aboriginal woman where there's lots of practices you can't do now because those custodians have died and they're like libraries that just get pulled down once they go, is capturing the story of where you are, archiving it, listening to the language of how to say hello, and everyone knows it, and just having that language, that visibility across your building, it gives value and it gives us a place that we know we still belong. There's nothing to fear. Yeah, we can have some argy-bargy, that's always good, but finding the common ground is really, really important. And I often say, we always talk about community and we see different diverse communities and we think we're all so far apart or we don't get each other. But really, community is common unity. And the unity we have with a RAP is about us all undergoing different changes in our lives and understanding our own truths and where we fit. Everybody wants to belong. And I don't want it to sound so idealistic that it's all going to be paradise, because it ain't. But if we learn the way of listening, deep listening, you might learn one gold nugget that will change your world and change your thinking. So every morning now, when I wake up, and I've been doing it since I lost my sister. She was murdered, and it was like this whole huge world had got, and we were twins. And I could have gone, blamed the white man. I could have blamed all manner of things. But who wants to be a victim, right? How do you get a victim out of the trenches? Wake up every day and say, what am I going to learn today that will make me a better Aboriginal? Make me a better Widjabul woman. And so it sounds a bit wanky even, but I tell you, it gives me purpose.
It doesn't.
Every morning. And if you walk into your workplace with joy and go, how are we going to make a design today that is going to bring joy to an artist or a young kid who has painted something on the ground in sand and they see it in the markings in their school, immediate pride, no matter who you are.
That's wonderful. Wow, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That's amazing. Well, that's an action plan, I think. That's an action plan for us. That's the way forward. Finally, then, if you look ahead, I don't know, 30, 40 years, what are your hopes and dreams for this?
I still go, we don't realise what we have. And you don't realise what you have until you've lost it, right? The old cliche. But we are sitting on such a unique continent with incredible people. And we've just got to get to know each other. And again, it's that trust. But what I hope to see for the future is opportunities for communities where cultural tourism not only brings them economic independence, we need that. We don't want to be on, who wants to be on welfare? It's humiliating. But sometimes, generation after generation, there is no other way. Now we have a time to shift that. No matter what it is, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want to work because they're working on country. And working to them is telling people about their country. Taking risks, I think, has to be our future KPI in a way. But I truly think when you sit down in the circle, and if you think of a circle, there is no one above you, there's no one below you, no one behind you, and no one in front of you. You are side by side, like we're doing here, Rob. Side by side, just chatting. And that makes a difference when you're being spoken with rather than when you're being spoken about or at. So I think we can slowly make, and there's some great people, we see it, this next generation, I think we're seeing a huge change and a shift. In the last 2 years, we've seen it. So if we can approach that, what is the story of country? Who are the people? Engage with them. By starting a reconciliation action plan, you get to know about your company because you're digging deep in and unpacking what your company does. But what you've done, on the other hand, is in the Sydney language, they say Panji Jaminka. You've extended your hand in friendship. It's an extension going, we're going to have a wrap. Wow, oh my God, you're going to come and talk to us. Great. Let's do it together. Let's make a commitment. It's a marriage. And in a great marriage, it's trust, faith, and never telling lies again.
Fantastic. Well, Rhoda, it's wonderful to finish this on a message of hope. It really is. So, let me just conclude by thanking you so much for the guidance that you've offered us over the last 18 months, and in particular this last hour or so, where I think you've really helped us as we move through this first stage of enlightenment around the need for reconciliation. I've super enjoyed the conversation. I hope everybody else watching will. I'm sure they will. And all I can say once again is thank you so much for sharing that with us. And we hope to keep you very much in the loop as we go forward here.
It's for life, Rob.
Thank you, Rhoda, once again. Great
Thank
to
you
talk to
so much.